All right, welcome to the Einstein Forum. I'm Susan Neiman. Usually I open the conference, which takes place every year about this time, in conjunction with and participation with our wonderful International Board of Advisors. I usually open it by saying this is my favorite time of year or the biggest event of the year, which it is. This year, it's the opening of a Denkfest, which will continue after a summer break to catch our collective breath on August 23rd with the opening of an art installation designed by Peter Greenaway and Saskia Boudica in the Orangerie of the New Gardens next to Sans Souci. That installation, called The Power of Enlightenment, Walking with Kant, will frame a series of events, including the entire version of the musical play by Daniel Kahn, which you'll hear a partial preview of tomorrow, a new production of The Magic Flute, and 2 other conferences. Let me begin by thanking the ridiculously overworked staff of the Einstein Forum for their engagement, endurance, and unpaid overtime in putting together a program which would be daunting for a much larger institution. Give it up for... One of the better German reviews of my recent book, Left is Not Woke, was called, the title was Fangirl of the Enlightenment. And I don't actually mind the appellation. When I came to the Einstein Forum nearly a quarter century ago, it seemed to me a chance to reinvent the great 18th century salons of Berlin and Paris, which were far more interesting and powerful in exchanging ideas and setting intellectual standards than the universities of the time. My new colleagues blanched at the word salon, which in current German parlance means something that isn't really taken seriously, but there were bigger problems. Enlightenment bashing in most circles has become so trendy in the last couple of decades that it's enlightenment itself which is no longer taken seriously. Thinking back on our program over the last couple of decades, I think we've managed to create something of which Rahel van Hagen or Madame Geoffrin would have been proud, particularly at these gatherings when our international board is present. I wasn't aware of having an intellectual and certainly not an ideological agenda as I invited people to join the board over the years. I just picked people whose work I admired and who I assumed would admire at least most of the other board members. But a few years ago, I began reflecting on whether they had anything in common, and it occurred to me that all of them buck current international trends and adhere to something like Enlightenment principles. I know Kostik, who isn't here tonight, is going to argue against the Enlightenment on Monday, but self-criticism is part of the Enlightenment project. I had no idea when I asked Eva Manasse to join the board that her internet password was Enlightenment, Aufklärung in German. Did you change it in the new apartment? No, good. I started thinking about this introduction last week, and I actually wish I'd finished writing these notes because the past week has brought us events that try the conviction of even those of us who don't mind being called fangirls or boys of the Enlightenment. I haven't really had the bandwidth to follow the disastrous French elections or the latest unfathomable events in Israel-Palestine. I've been too caught up in following U.S. events and scanning the press for signs that it ain't so. 2 things that may have slipped some of your attention. Bad enough that Joe Biden's performance made Donald Trump seem almost presidential. Worse for me was the claim, repeated in a number of papers a few days later, which said Biden was resisting the appeals of virtually all of the media to quit the race for president because he mostly listens to his family, who urge him to stay in the race, and that he particularly values the advice of his son Hunter. You needn't have followed the details of Hunter Biden's trial and conviction for felony, I know I didn't, to know that the man is a grifter and a crackhead with a clear vested interest in his father remaining in the White House. This is the person whose advice the good guy takes? My despair over that, and he, now newest information, he accompanies his father to White House meetings. My despair over that fact hardly had time to congeal when the Supreme Court of the United States announced it was voiding the basic Enlightenment principle of equality before the law, at least for U.S. presidents. As one of the dissenting justices made explicit, the president can now hire an assassin to murder a political rival and never face trial. I suppose the immunity doesn't extend to the assassin, but anyone who's watched a gangster film can guess how that will work out. There are two possible plot outcomes. As I was fumbling with my own despair the last few days in an attempt to come up with a rousing opening for this conference, I was reminded that my very first conference at the Einstein Forum was based on a book that had just been published by Hans Magnus Enzensberger, then a new member of our board, which reprinted parts of Diderot's encyclopedia and invited contemporary authors to write their own entries. We called the conference Wozu noch Aufklärung, which isn't easy to translate, but one sense of it is, why the hell is anyone still talking about the Enlightenment? Especially because it's nicely ambiguous. It seemed a good title until shortly before the conference, which took place about 3 weeks after September 11th, which also for a moment made the title feel hollow. Thinking we'd been through this before, I found my introduction to that conference, hoping there was something I could recycle, or at least recover some of the determination to defend the Enlightenment to which I've always returned. Most of that talk was about 9/11, but it did begin with a thought I'd forgotten. It's complex worldviews which are the most fragile, as Jean Amarie's great essay on the intellectual at Auschwitz showed us. And Omri, who survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald to become a defender of the Enlightenment par excellence, knew that most criticisms of the Enlightenment are based on caricatures, which made it an object of aggression for thinkers like Adorno or Isaiah Berlin, who had absolutely nothing else in common. So we've been told over and over how Enlightenment faith that humankind was good and getting steadily better was sadly misplaced. But the idea that life is not as good and the world is not as simple as optimists believe might have been news to Candide. It hardly needed saying to Voltaire. And I really don't understand what basic hermeneutical failures allow people to forget that this critique of Enlightenment came from the heart of Enlightenment itself. Cut this a little bit shorter. Besides the idea that the Enlightenment thinkers were foolish optimists who ignored all the evidence that human nature is not the best of all possible natures, there are other simple myths about the Enlightenment that provide fuel for anti-Enlightenment fires, but can't hold up to 10 minutes worth of historical scrutiny. One is that Enlightenment thinkers held every problem to be resolvable by reason, arrogantly overestimating the intellect or even using it as an instrument to dominate nature. It's an idea that rests on a binary opposition between reason and nature no Enlightenment thinker would have accepted. The two might seem to conflict because reason's ability to ask what is natural and what is not is the first step towards any form of progress. Remember what was considered natural in the 18th century: slavery, poverty, the subjection of women, feudal hierarchies, and most forms of illness. Well into the 19th century, English clerics argued that attempts to relieve the Irish famine would defy God's order. Enlightenment thinkers were hardly opposed to nature or to passion, But they knew how often oppression is justified by claims of supposed natural order, and they were determined to use reason to subject those claims to rigorous scrutiny. Every time you argue that an economic, racial, or gender inequality is not inevitable, you are using your reason to question those who insist that those inequalities are just part of the way the world is. There are a number of other myths that are repeated about the Enlightenment. I've long argued for taking back the Enlightenment from the cliches that surround it, that it held human nature to be perfect and human progress to be inevitable, reason to be unlimited, and science to be infallible, faith to be an outworn answer to the questions of the past, and technology a solution to all the problems of the future. In fact, no era was more aware of the existence of evil. No era took more care in probing human limits and bounds. It took aim not at reverence, but at superstition and idolatry. It never thought that progress was inevitable, only that it's possible. But there was one reproach when I wrote a book about all of those questions about 15 years ago that I didn't bother to answer because I thought it was so patently ignorant it would soon disappear. So much for my ability to anticipate intellectual trends. With the increasing permeation of post-colonial theory into so many cultural fields, the claim that the Enlightenment was a white Eurocentric project designed to impose allegedly universal values on unsuspecting non-Europeans has come to seem not only true, but obvious. So because I know some of our speakers will address some of these claims, but I want to take a moment to run through this here, okay? I want to begin with a quote from a work that most of us wish Kant hadn't written, and indeed that he didn't actually write. The Anthropology was based on his students' notes. But hidden among some embarrassing and even vile remarks are occasional gems like this one. Here's a quote from Kant, maybe, according to his students. It is a peculiar habit of our capacity of attentiveness to focus precisely on that which is flawed about someone else, and to do so unintentionally. To focus on the missing button on the coat of the other, or the gap in the teeth, or on an acquired speech defect, and consequently to cause consternation in the other, but also to debase ourselves in the process. I particularly like the remark about debasing ourselves when we focus on flaws. As Goethe said, reading Kant's work is, for some of us at least, not only like entering a well-lit room. Some of his asides, especially about human failings, shine light beams on simple but deep traits we somehow fail to notice. Freud didn't give us better. Focusing solely on someone's flaws does debase us. I've noticed a slight feeling of ugliness after an hour spent dissecting a colleague's failings. Of course, there are colleagues whose behavior merits criticism, and there are ugly ways to do it and ways that are respectful and possibly constructive. But I always feel better about myself and go away happier when I've spent an hour talking about colleagues I admire. Kant's remark about focusing on flaws resonates with the flurry of writing on Kant's alleged racism and colonialism, which began some 30 years ago, but is now the very hottest topic in Kant studies both among professionals and the general public. It's not just our increased attention to racism and colonialism that have made them a focus of Kant discussion. In general, I think it's a good thing that we become more aware of the history of colonialism and the impact of systemic racism. Still, there's something about the ceaseless focus on the question, just how racist was he, that feels hyena-like, a debasing enjoyment of chewing over the flaws in Kant's work. I'll mention the three possibilities that Kant scholars have come up with for dealing with the slew of undeniably racist remarks sprinkled through some of Kant's work. One is you can ignore those passages as you would ignore a gap in someone's teeth or a button missing on his coat out of politeness and the desire not to debase ourselves by focusing on flaws. The second possibility is one that's ascendant, perhaps because it's the easiest and a simple swing of the pendium. And this is to argue that Kant's racism is not incidental but systemic and infects all his work. Unfortunately, it's the view that's increasingly standard not only among Kant scholars, but as exemplified, say, by the English Wikipedia article on Kant. I don't know if Cheryce is here. Hi, okay. It simply and bold, she pointed this out to me, that Wikipedia simply states that Kant was a racist, both in the introductory paragraph and a separate section devoted to the racism which Wikipedia's authors assert calls his cosmopolitanism into question. And the Kant scholar Cheryce von Xylander tried repeatedly to get Wikipedia at least to problematize the statement, but found that the assertions were mysteriously reinstated and her comments deleted every time, unless you have news on that you want to tell us tomorrow. There's a third possibility. The last time we talked, that was the case. There's a third possibility which acknowledges the repugnant passages but argues that Kant grew out of them, though there are no texts in which he actually says, "I changed my mind." I would only add that whatever subjective process accompanied Kant's development, it was objectively a case of progress of theoretical and practical reason, something the Kantians among us should surely cheer. Why not assume that he came to see that his remarks about non-European peoples were completely inconsistent with his moral and metaphysical views? We could then applaud the fact that he did so as an instance of moral progress that's much more convincing than the one he gives in the Streit der Fakultäten, the hope that disinterested observers feel on observing the French Revolution. The fact that it took time for even the greatest of thinkers to refine and develop his views and bring them into something close to coherence should give us hope that others can do the same, rather than wallowing in the disappointment that he didn't get it right all at once. Kant's belief in the power of reason is always combined with an awareness of its limits. Who knows? Had he been granted another decade or two, he might have even retracted his disgraceful remarks about Jews and women. As a Jewish woman, I should say I never thought his comments on my tribe or tribes were worth more attention than the missing button on a coat. The flaws pale in the face of the splendor of his critical theory. But I'm much less worried about philosophers and certainly Kant scholars than I am worried about a cultural practice that's present over much of the globe. Crudely put, it's a battle between Enlightenment and post-colonialism, and the Enlightenment is losing. And it's the crude versions that remain in the culture, and now I'm not talking about Wikipedia. I'm thinking, for example, of a talk by a distinguished German sociologist that casually referred to the dialectic of enlightenment, you know, what Adorno and Horkheimer saw as the dark side, colonialism, and so on. Asked for a passage in which dialectic of enlightenment mentions colonialism, he couldn't point to one, of course, but there's no softer target today than the Enlightenment, even if much of Enlightenment bashing rolls every possible reproach into a soupy sort of mud in hopes that one will stick. A century ago, it was the modern that was the source of all our ills. Blaming the Enlightenment sounds more exact, but it really isn't. The strangest thing about the dismissal of the Enlightenment as Eurocentric is the fact that it was the Enlightenment itself that invented the charge of Eurocentrism. When contemporary post-colonial theorists rightly insist that we learn to view the world from the perspective of non-Europeans, they're echoing a tradition that goes back to Montesquieu, who used fictional Persians to criticize European mores in ways he could not safely have done in his own voice. Racism and colonialism need not go together, but it's easier for colonialism when they do, since racism seems to provide a sort of justification for colonialism. So I'll say a few words about the two together. But you can be colonialist, even genocidally colonialist, without being racist at all, as we should know at the latest from Thucydides. The Athenians didn't consider the Malians racially inferior to them, just smaller and weaker. That was enough. Big states swallow little ones as night swallows day. It's a law of nature against which reason has no claim. Stronger nations have overtaken weaker ones since the beginning of recorded history, indeed, since there were nations in our sense at all. Until the last century, imperialism was as universal a political practice as any. The Romans and the Chinese created empires, as did the Assyrians, the Aztecs, the Malayans, the Khmer, the Mughals, the Ottomans, to name just a few. Those empires operated with different degrees of brutality and repression, but all of them were based on an equation of might and right, which amounts to no concept of right at all. All of them used their power to compel weaker groups to surrender resources, submit tribute, press soldiers into service for further imperial wars, and accept commands that overrode local custom and law. As far as we know, there was only one thing they lacked: a guilty conscience. What was new in the 18th century was not colonialism, but the opposition to it. Okay? Yes, Bartolomé de las Casas protested the cruelty of Spanish treatment of Native Americans, but he didn't protest the institutions of slavery or colonialism themselves. It's enough to make defenders of, but the Enlightenment did. I left out a bunch of marvelous quotes that some of you will know, and I can give you the references later, in which Enlightenment authors go actually rather further than Frantz Fanon in suggesting that peoples in threat of being colonized should shoot them down and leave not one alive to tell the tale. But how often have you seen sentences proclaiming what's called the ambivalence of the Enlightenment? Like, the Enlightenment was the age of reason and human rights, but it was also the age of slavery and colonialism. That sentence was prominently placed like a mantra at the Kant exhibit in Bonn, and I'm sure we'll see it at most of the other Kant exhibits. This not only confuses causation and correlation, it turns history and the history of ideas upside down. What Enlightenment thinkers began was not the defense of colonialism, but the opposition to it. And not only through general claims about dignity and human rights, but with very particular examples. Now, given that evidence, how did the myth of Enlightenment support for colonialism hold sway? I'm afraid the explanation is easy, unless somebody has a better one. Like progressive intellectuals everywhere, radical Enlightenment thinkers didn't win all their battles. None of the people in this room is responsible for the war on Iraq or the bombing of Gaza, though many of us put in considerable time and energy into opposing them. Like the authors of the Enlightenment, one could look back on us and say those oppositions were useless because we didn't actually stop the wars. While Kant and others changed the thinking of their contemporaries on many questions, they didn't stop the great European rush for empire that gathered full force in the 19th century. Yet, if they didn't stop colonialism, they succeeded in giving it a bad conscience, and once ideas come to light, they demand realization. The Romans felt no remorse or need to justify their empire, nor did they tell their subjects that being colonized was good for them. In addition to better ships and weapons, 19th century colonizers had something earlier imperialists lacked: a need for legitimacy. And sadly, I think this must be the source of the legend that the Enlightenment sanctioned colonialism. As Svetlana Todorov wrote, to attribute colonial expansion or the division of Africa to the humanist project of exporting the Enlightenment is to take at face value what was only propaganda, an attempt often a clumsy one, to replaster the facade of a building constructed for quite different purposes. I'm going to end there and give the floor to Fintan O'Toole. Our practice at the Einstein Forum is to give you a brochure which should give you all of, or the information, at least basic information, about any of the speakers you would like to know. We've constructed a truly wonderful and varied program of all of Fintan's amazingly prolific work and accomplishments. I'll mention the one that we're most happy about. He's a new member of the board of the Einstein Forum.